The garden party was held on a Tuesday, which Edmund Harwick always thought was a strange day for a celebration. Tuesdays felt like working days, like ledger books and tenant meetings, and the sound of boots on wet stone. But the Ashford family had chosen a Tuesday, and the Ashford family had money, and so the garden was full of people wearing their best clothes and pretending the weather was warmer than it was. Edmund arrived alone. He was 34 years old, the fourth Duke of Harwick, and he had learned to move through crowded rooms with a kind of careful stillness that people sometimes mistook for arrogance. It was not arrogance. It was the particular exhaustion of a man who had inherited both a great house and all of its problems, and who had been managing both for 12 years without complaint. Harwick Hall was beautiful. It was also expensive in the way that old things are expensive, not because anyone is spending money carelessly, but because age itself cost something. The roof needed work. The east wing had a damp problem that had resisted 3 separate attempts at repair. The tenant farms were productive, but barely. Edmund had done everything a careful man could do, and it had kept things steady, but steady was not the same as safe. He needed a wife. More precisely, his estate needed the kind of arrangement that a good marriage could provide. He was not cruel about this fact. He simply understood it clearly, the way he understood crop rotations and interest rates. The Ashford introduction had been arranged through a mutual friend. The eldest daughter, Miss Eleanor Ashford, was 26, well-educated, composed, and the family had money that had been made sensibly and kept more sensibly still. Edmund had exchanged 2 letters with her father. Everything was in order. He spotted a young woman standing near the rose hedge at the far end of the garden. She was not standing with the group of women near the refreshment table, and she was not making conversation with anyone. She was looking at the roses with the expression of someone who was actually thinking about something, not just appearing to think. Edmund found this immediately interesting. He walked over. She turned when she heard his footsteps on the gravel path, and she did not look startled the way many young women did when a duke appeared suddenly beside them. She looked at him directly, which he also found interesting. They spoke for nearly 40 minutes. He learned that she had opinions about the design of formal gardens, that she thought rose hedges were often planted too close together for vanity reasons, and that the gardeners suffered for it, that she had read 3 books in the past month, and could describe all 3 without being asked. She laughed at something he said about the difficulty of keeping a very old house standing, and the laugh was genuine, not performed. He walked away from that conversation thinking that marrying Eleanor Ashford might be something he could genuinely look forward to. What Edmund did not know, and what no one told him that afternoon, was that Eleanor Ashford had been inside the house with a headache for most of the party. The young woman near the rose hedge was her younger sister, Catherine. Catherine was 22, quieter than Eleanor in company, but more open in conversation, and she had been standing apart from the group because she had never been entirely comfortable in crowds. No one had introduced her properly to Edmund. No one had corrected the assumption. The afternoon had moved on, and the mistake had settled into the day like dust settling after a carriage passes. The betrothal was announced between Edmund and Eleanor 6 weeks later. The wedding took place the following March, on a cold morning that smelled of rain that had not yet arrived. Eleanor was composed and lovely. Edmund stood at the altar with the posture of a man who had made a decision and intended to honor it. The 300 guests agreed it was a very fine match. The early months of the marriage were polite. Edmund and Eleanor were not unkind to each other. They simply did not know each other very well, and neither of them was particularly good at changing that quickly. Eleanor ran the household with impressive efficiency. Edmund spent his days on the estate. They had dinner together most evenings and spoke about sensible things. It was a functional marriage. It was, in many ways, exactly what both of them had agreed to. Catherine arrived at Harwick Hall in June, 3 months after the wedding. She was to stay for a fortnight and help Eleanor settle properly into her new home. She came by carriage on a warm afternoon and stepped into the entrance hall carrying a small travel bag and looking around at the high ceilings and the old portraits with open curiosity. Edmund was crossing the hall when she arrived. He stopped. He had not recognized her at the garden party as someone he would see again, and he had thought of the woman near the rose hedge only occasionally in the months since, in the vague way that a pleasant conversation sometimes returns to the mind without reason. But standing in his own entrance hall, watching her look up at the ceiling, the same way she had looked at the roses, He felt something settle in his chest that he did not immediately understand. He greeted her correctly. He showed her to her room. He said all of the appropriate things and none of the wrong ones. But that evening, when the three of them sat together after dinner, and Catherine asked him about the history of the house, he answered her for 20 minutes, without noticing how much time had passed. She wanted to know about the family who had built the east wing, and why the windows faced north when south would have been warmer, and whether the damp problem was in the stone or in the mortar. And he found himself telling her things about Harwick Hall that he had never said aloud to anyone, because no one had ever asked in precisely that way. Eleanor watched this from her chair across the room. She said nothing. The fortnight passed. Catherine said goodbye on a bright morning and climbed back into the carriage, and Edmund stood on the steps and watched it until it turned the corner of the drive and disappeared behind the trees. Then he went inside and did not think about it again, because thinking about it was not something a decent man could afford to do. The following year, Catherine's engagement ended. The man she had been promised to was not cruel, but he was wrong for her, in a way that neither of them had been able to name, until it became impossible to ignore. The engagement was ended quietly, and Catherine was left in the slightly difficult position of a young woman in her 20s, who was now unattached in a world that had clear opinions about what that meant. Eleanor wrote to her immediately. Eleanor was practical above all things, and practically speaking, Catherine needed somewhere to be while the situation settled. Eleanor invited her to spend the summer at Harwick Hall. Edmund received this news at breakfast. He read Eleanor's note twice. He set it down beside his coffee cup. He looked out the window at the morning light on the fields for a long moment, and then he went to answer his correspondence. Catherine arrived in early July. The summer of 1889 was warm and long, and the gardens at Harwick Hall were at their best. Catherine walked in them every morning, and sometimes Edmund walked with her, because the route she took passed near the outer farm buildings he needed to inspect, and it was natural to walk the same path. They did not talk about anything dangerous. They talked about the estate, about books, about the debate in the House of Lords that summer over agricultural reform, which Catherine had read about in the newspapers and had thoughts on that were sharp and well-reasoned. Edmund listened to her the way he listened to his land agent, with the specific attention a man gives to someone who is actually saying something useful. He did not examine what he felt. Examining it would have required naming it, and naming it was not something he was willing to do. Catherine, walking beside him through the long July evenings, was doing her own version of the same thing. She had understood, somewhere in the previous year, what the garden party confusion had meant. She had put the pieces together quietly, in the privacy of her own room in Dorset, and the picture they formed was one she had immediately decided to set aside. It was not her story to tell. It would have broken something that could not be fixed, and breaking things was not in her nature. She was kind to Eleanor. She was careful with Edmund. She told herself this was manageable, and for most of the summer, it was. Eleanor watched. Eleanor had always been the most observant person in any room, and she had spent 26 years being the eldest sister, which meant she had spent 26 years watching Catherine, knowing her expressions and her silences, and the particular way she went quiet when something was affecting her that she did not intend to show. Eleanor knew what was happening, in the same way that a person knows a storm is coming before the sky changes. Not through accusation, not through drama, simply through the accumulated evidence of small things, the way a conversation shifted when Catherine entered, the way Edmund's attention moved without his appearing to notice it, the way Catherine never quite met her eyes when the three of them were together in the evenings. Eleanor said nothing. She was not a woman who confronted things before she understood them fully. In October, she fell ill. It began as a common cold and became something worse, a respiratory illness that kept her in bed for 3 weeks and left her genuinely frightened in the way that illness sometimes frightens people who are not accustomed to being weak. Edmund sat with her in the evenings. He brought her books and broth and managed the household in her absence with a thoroughness that surprised them both. It was during those weeks, in the quiet of her room with the fire burning low, that Eleanor and Edmund spoke to each other honestly for the first time in nearly 2 years of marriage. She told him, on an evening when she was well enough to sit up and her voice had mostly returned, that she had always known she was not the woman he had spoken to at the garden party. She said it simply, without anger, the way she said most things. Edmund sat very still. He did not ask how she knew. he did not deny it. He told her instead the thing that had been sitting in him for 2 years without a name. He told her that he had come into their marriage looking for something he had glimpsed for 40 minutes in a garden, and that he had been looking for it in the wrong direction ever since, and that this was a failure he owned entirely and had no right to place on anyone else. Eleanor listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said that she had come into the marriage looking for stability and purpose, and that she had found both. She said that she was not unhappy, which was different from saying she was happy, and that she understood the difference perfectly well. She said she would like them to try harder, not to perform something that was not there, but to actually look at each other, the way they had looked at each other that evening in her sick room, and try to build something from what was real, rather than from what had been arranged. Edmund agreed. It was not a romantic agreement. It was more like the agreement he made every spring with the land, a decision to put in the work and see what grew. And Catherine left Harwick Hall in November. She did not make a scene of it. She said her goodbyes warmly and clearly, and she pressed Eleanor's hand for a moment longer than usual, and she did not look at Edmund for more than a moment, and then she climbed into the carriage and was gone. She married in 1892. A naval officer from Portsmouth, a steady and decent man who found her intelligent and said so, who made her laugh in a way that was uncomplicated and real. She moved to the coast. She wrote to Eleanor every week for the rest of their lives, long letters full of observations about the sea and the town, and the particular dramas of a household near a naval base. Eleanor wrote back with equal regularity, letters about the estate and the tenants, and the slow improvement of the East Wing, which was finally, after a third attempt, properly repaired. Edmund and Eleanor lived at Harwick Hall for 31 years after that autumn. The estate recovered. Edmund spent years working on agricultural reform and earned a reputation in the House of Lords as a man who understood land and people with equal seriousness. Eleanor ran the house and the surrounding community with a competence that local people spoke of long after she was gone. They were not a love story in the way that love stories are usually told, but something had grown between them in that sick room, in the honesty of that conversation, that proved to be more durable than many things that begin with feeling. They became, over years, people who genuinely knew each other. That turned out to matter more than Edmund had expected. Eleanor died in 1921, on a quiet morning in early spring. Edmund sat with her until the end. He lived for 4 more years, managing the estate from habit as much as anything, walking the same paths he had walked for decades, past the outer farms and through the gardens. People who knew him in those final years said he was a man at peace, which surprised some of them, because they thought a man who had lived his whole life doing the right thing at the cost of the thing he wanted would carry more visible weight. But Edmund Harwick had understood something that takes most people a very long time to understand, if they ever do. The life a person chooses in the first moment is not the only life available to them. Inside the life he had ended up in, there had been real work, real respect, real honesty, and eventually, something that was close enough to love that the distance no longer seemed worth measuring. He had not gotten the story he had walked into that garden hoping to find. He had lived a different one instead. It had been enough, more than enough. It had, in the end, been his.